3, 2, 1. Rules Committee will come to order. Many roads, bridges, and highways in America today are at a dangerous point of disrepair. The most recent report by the American Society of Civil Engineers graded infrastructure in the United States at a D+. This is a national emergency. If our roads or bridges aren't safe, then the countless numbers of commuters who rely on them every day aren't safe either. I've got bridges in my district that are old enough to qualify for Medicare. Others are older than some states. There are infrastructure challenges all across the country. We've been waiting for a real plan from this administration to deal with since day one. It's time to act. That's why today we're considering H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act. This bill would revitalize America's existing infrastructure and fund new projects that get people back to work, something that's badly needed when you look at the latest job numbers. It achieves this while improving the safety of our communities and protecting our environment at the same time. It is a win-win. This bill also triples funding for Amtrak and invests in schools, housing, broadband, drinking water, and healthcare and infrastructure. And it will finally address some of the long-standing disparities in neighborhoods across the country that, quite frankly, have been left behind too many times. H.R. 2 is all about creating jobs today, but it's also about investing in our future and laying the foundation for economic growth in all our districts for decades to come. Before I turn to our witnesses, let me first turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our hearing today is on H.R. 2, which started out as the majority's attempt to reauthorize the highway bill, but has since morphed into the Speaker's $1.5 trillion infrastructure wish list. In the past, the surface transportation bill has always been a bipartisan endeavor. Safety Lou in 2005, MAP 21 in 2012, and the FAST Act in 2015 were all bipartisan bills that reauthorized highway programs, allocated money to other surface transportation priorities, and ensured that the Highway Trust Fund would remain solvent. But today, the majority is moving forward with a partisan and deeply flawed bill. In the surface transportation reauthorization piece of the bill that was reported out of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee last week, while critical and necessary highway construction programs are reauthorized, the majority has made sure that these programs will be smothered in red tape and has made sure that every infrastructure program is actually now a climate change program. New grant programs and new mandates are added that will siphon off funding from places it really needs to go. New environmental mandates derived from the Green New Deal will snarl construction projects at every turn. And a focus on mass transit means that rural and suburban districts, exactly like the one I represent, will be forced to spend surface transportation dollars in inefficient ways instead of on road repairs and road constructions like we so desperately need. To make matters worse, the bill doesn't even ensure the Highway Trust Fund remains solvent. It just transfers funds into it from the general tax revenue. And once this bill was reported out of committee, it morphed from a partisan highway bill reauthorization to a massive $1.5 trillion Democratic wish list. The majority tacked on all sorts of things that are not normally found in the surface transportation bill. $9 billion for a new broadband internet benefit program and $80 billion to build broadband infrastructure. $200 million for solar installations, billions of dollars for hospital construction, $1 billion for abandoned mines, a tax credit for people who buy electric cars. I could go on and on and on. Mr. Chairman, some of these may be good or even worthy ideas for consideration, but tacking on a wish list like this is not the way to achieve bipartisan consensus on the highway bill. This is an enormously expensive list of projects without any basis in reality or even any indication that this covers what our national infrastructure needs actually are. And I'd remind this committee that this bill is ultimately going nowhere. It will not be passed by the Senate, and the president will not sign it. I think there's a much better way to do this. Republicans stand ready to work hand in hand with the majority on real bipartisan solutions. Maybe we will ultimately get there in the coming weeks, but I'm confident that the bill before us is not the way to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman and for his opening statement. I would just point out for the record that that this bill comes in, I think, $500 billion less than what the president said at one point he wanted. I would like to think the president might have no problem signing this, but then again, who knows where he is on a given day. But I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 2, the Moving Forward Act. Chairman DeFazio of Oregon, Chairman Neal of Massachusetts, Mr. Davis of Illinois, and Mr. Estes of Kansas. We are delighted that you're here. Without objection, any written materials you submit to rules-documents@mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentleman from Oregon, Chairman DeFazio.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I will summarize, as you said, my full testimony will be in the record. A year ago, last March, we went down to the White House, met with the president, and he bid us up to $2 trillion for infrastructure, which we could productively spend. Nancy was saying 1 to 1.3, and he said, no, 1.9. They said, no, 2 sounds better. So it was $2 trillion. Then we talked about, just listening to some of the criticism from your ranking member, what was included in infrastructure. And it was roads, bridges, transit, rail, wastewater, drinking water, and yes, broadband. That was the package the president agreed to. Of course, when we came back to talk about funding, he walked out. In fact, the president's last 2 budgets actually cut funding for transportation. So we've had multiple transportation weeks under this administration, lots of empty promises, big numbers, but their only actual legislative proposals have been to reduce funding for transportation. The system's falling apart. We have 47,000 bridges on the national highway system that need substantial repair or replacement. 40% of the national highway system is deteriorated to the point where it has to be rebuilt, not just overlaid like Obama did. And we also have $106 billion to bring up transit to a state of good repair, let alone provide new transit options. The good news is that all of these things, when we make these investments, will produce one heck of a lot of American jobs, because we have the strongest Buy America requirements of any part of the federal government, much stronger than the Pentagon. The Pentagon ought to think about that in terms of national security. And we're going to close the last few remaining loopholes that the Chinese are trying to drive through with some rail cars and transit. And that being said, we also have strong labor protections. These will be living wage jobs, and we're going to need a lot of jobs. This is the recovery package coming out of this pandemic. A lot of jobs aren't coming back. We are going to need those jobs. Now, I hear complaints that it's not bipartisan because it deals with climate change. Yep, you're right. I think everybody on my side of the aisle, maybe not, there might be someone, I don't know, believes that climate change is an incredible threat, and we need to reduce fossil fuel pollution. Even John Barrasso from Wyoming, big gas state, even he included fossil fuel reduction provisions in his bill. Now, they were standalone provisions, isolated. They could be easily cut out. Our bill is written in a way that they are integrated, as I heard the ranking member complain. He's right. They are. They're integrated throughout the bill in terms of our goals and our objectives, but they are achievable, and they will create, as I said, lots of jobs. As we rebuild the system, we have to rebuild it resistant to severe weather events. Whether or not you believe in climate change, I do find that on the other side of the aisle, they will say, yeah, we probably ought to deal with ocean rise, but we don't know why it's rising. We probably ought to deal with these unbelievable storm events, even though we don't know why they're happening, and more frequent and more severe hurricanes. So as we rebuild the system, we rebuild it more resilient. There are also our new materials. We can reduce carbon pollution from concrete with no change in the kilns by 50%. by merely changing the mix that goes in, a mix that's been used in Europe for decades. It's actually more durable. We are going to incentivize states to reduce their carbon pollution as they rebuild the infrastructure. And the asphalt industry has also made progress in terms of reducing its footprint. So we're going to encourage that. We're also going to restore robust programs for pedestrian and cycling, which were wiped out in the last two Republican bills. Well, they wiped out the programs they're named for and safe routes to schools. They hated that. But we're bringing it back in a robust way because we're seeing a heck of a lot of people resorting to that sort of transportation now. And more people want to do that, and they want to do it safely. And cycling, pedestrian deaths are up. So safety is another big aspect woven into this bill in all modes. We're looking at complete streets. Again, in response to the ranking member, we are not ignoring rural America. I represent a huge district, the 40th largest in Congress. The majority of my district is rural, small cities. And we are going to do new investments with programs targeted to rural America in this bill. He must not have read the bill. I realize it's rather long. We even have a new, very large program for off National Highway System bridges in states, in rural areas. Those are in rural areas. And majority of the other 47,000 that need to be replaced are in rural areas too. So we are not ignoring the needs of rural America. There's some new transit made available. I have some very small cities that want to access transit funds, and certainly the suburban areas need better access. We also are going to deal with issues that relate to minorities in terms of the disadvantaged business enterprises, in terms of funding that will provide more transit access to job centers for people who are now isolated from it. I hear from my colleagues, even in the LA basin, who say, I represent this district. My people are service workers. They can't get to downtown LA without changing buses 5 times. They need better options in those areas. All this will reduce congestion, pollution, and those are all good things. And then also it does include the first reauthorization of the SRF wastewater fund since 1987. The federal government used to be a great partner with our communities in terms of wastewater investments. We're going to get back into doing that. There are a lot of people now, a lot of utilities are experiencing very high delinquency rates because of the COVID crisis. Some of them are shutting off the water and the sewer, and some of them aren't. Then that means they have to eat it. We tried in the CARES Act to get some money to help people with their bills. The Republicans objected. This bill will help communities to build out their systems, build them out in a way that's affordable for their citizens. It does include drinking water from the Energy and Commerce Committee. It also will finally, it invests in rail. The Northeast Corridor is a mess. And when the tunnel under Baltimore or the Portal Bridge or the tunnels under the Hudson fail, that's going to be a 30% impact on the economy of the United States. It's stupid not to build those projects. I'm pleased to see the Trump administration finally released money for the Portal Bridge. Still nothing for the tunnels under the Hudson. And on the Baltimore tunnel, it's a beautiful tunnel built in 1872, but it's not going to last much longer. But also the national routes for Amtrak, new power for Amtrak, and investments in high-speed and higher-speed rail. And then finally, harbors. We have been collecting a tax from the American people since Ronald Reagan created the program to fund the dredging and the maintenance of our harbors, and the jetties and other work. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has been diverting part of those funds every year since Ronald Reagan. There's $9.3 billion sitting in the Treasury. And when I raised this issue in front of the president, he got very excited. He said, $10 billion to spend and no new taxes. I said, that's right, Mr. President. He turned to Kudlow and said, Kudlow, fix that. Well, it hasn't been fixed yet. Got a partial fix in the CARES Act. This bill will finally access that $9.3 billion to make needed investments in our harbors and again, create more jobs. That's a brief summary of my portions of the bill. I cannot really address the other portions of the bill. That would be up to other committee chairs.
Thank you very much. Chairman Neal.
Chairman, this is a good piece of work, good legislation. It harkens back to a time as well when we were reminded that the easiest thing to do in Congress was an infrastructure bill, always done with input from both sides. I've been in regular communication with Secretary Mnuchin on this proposal, but remember in 1956, the transformative work of President Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, the leader in the Senate, and Sam Rayburn, the speaker in the House, and it did in fact transform America's transportation system. So we intend to use tools that are available in the tax code to provide state and local governments with the means to finance long-needed infrastructure projects on a historic scale. We have revamped tax subsidies for renewable energy and efficiency, pumping an additional $150 billion of support into those industries over the next 5 years. We restore the extremely successful Build America Bonds program, or BABS as you know. In 2009, it generated $180 billion worth of crucial infrastructure investment. We restore tax-exempt financing, refunding bonds, a crucial tool that Republicans cut out in their Tax Reform Act in December of 2017. We will ensure that municipalities can take advantage of low interest rates right now. We increased the volume cap on private activity bonds, enabling state and local governments to engage in more public-private partnerships to meet their infrastructure needs. For many of those new partnerships, we require that projects adhere to Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements, assuring that taxpayer-subsidized investments continue to create good-paying jobs for those doing the work. We also make the successful New Markets Tax Credit Program permanent and increase the allocation. This credit is a proven mechanism for funding community development projects in areas that might not otherwise attract investors. We've added provisions that significantly enhance tribal communities' abilities to issue tax-exempt debt and improve their ability to take advantage of programs like the New Markets Tax Credit Program. This bill meaningfully enhances the rehabilitation credit, encouraging even more development of otherwise outdated infrastructure, and we've added rules to make it much easier for public schools and other tax-exempt organizations to take advantage of these incentives. To make sure that the COVID crisis does not reduce the supply of housing, we make significant investments in the low-income housing tax credit, not the least of which is a 50% increase in state allocations, in addition to other programs to rehabilitate old housing stock. This package helps our economy and workers recover from the COVID recession, and the Ways and Means Committee makes sure to contribute measures to this legislation that tackles the climate crisis. We've included a historic investment aimed at reducing our nation's carbon emissions to meet formally the Paris Agreement climate goals. We extend and expand the federal tax incentives promoting investment in clean energy technologies, including wind, solar, geothermal, fuel cells, and other renewable fuels. We increase federal support for energy efficient homes and commercial buildings. We increase credits for manufacturers selling electric vehicles, including for the first time credits for electric buses and electric vehicles simultaneously, making it easier for Americans of any income group to take steps toward reducing their carbon footprint. To complement those credits, we've included tax incentives for developing electric vehicle charging infrastructure to ensure that we green the fleet. We have the capacity to support the additional vehicles that would then require electricity. On a personal note, and I know Mr. McGovern will be happy with this as well, there's $19 billion that's authorized here for rail. One of my long-held beliefs is that enhancing rail transportation from Boston to Springfield to Worcester and on to Pittsfield would be a transformative event in Massachusetts. That is one of our priorities. And to ensure that these new projects create great high-paying jobs for hardworking Americans that need them, we include a separate credit that rewards renewable energy projects that engage in responsible labor practices that prioritize workers' rights. Let me also point out that we recognize the toll of climate change and how it disproportionately affects Black Americans and other marginalized communities. We've included federal support for the development of environmental justice programs led by the nation's many high-quality historically Black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. Mr. Chairman and Mr. Cole, we have a unique opportunity here to make strategic investments in our communities, upgrade efficiencies to increase productivity and enhance the quality of life for all Americans let's seize the moment while we have the chance. Thanks for your attention to these issues.
Thank you very much, Chairman Neal, and you're right that I am very pleased with the revolutionary investments in passenger rail expansion, which obviously would help the Massachusetts economy, but quite frankly, it would help economies all over this country. I'm now happy to yield to Mr. Davis of Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the Rules Committee. Today, for the first time since I've been in Congress, I come before you to say that I will very likely vote against the surface bill and to let this committee know what a stark departure that is for me and many others on our side of the aisle. Mr. Chair, I know that as a former member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, you understand how important our committee's work is. You know it's vital that we pass a long-term surface transportation bill to provide states and local communities the certainty to plan and to undertake projects. And you know how damaging it is every time Congress passes an extension or, as it has been in the past, a series of extensions. Chairman McGovern, you also know that these bills usually come to the Rules Committee as bipartisan products. But I'm afraid that given how this bill was hijacked by the Speaker's partisan agenda, we are being set up for temporary extensions instead of legislating. And we will hand Americans and our states more uncertainty during already difficult times. Let me start by clarifying a big misconception regarding this bill and climate. I know that many Democrats want to address climate issues and that your party thinks Republican members are unwilling to join you in addressing those goals. However, as we made clear at markup, and I've made clear in many personal conversations with members on the other side of the aisle, and I will make again clear today, we all care about the environment and resiliency. And we all understand that in order to get bipartisan agreement, we must include priorities from both sides of the aisle. Sadly, I don't think that's what the Speaker wanted. Now to discuss H.R. 2, how it originated and how it's changed. In committee, we marked up the Invest in America Act. It's amazing that in a little over a week, Democrats tripled the cost of the bill, airdropped provisions that so many committees never considered, and changed its name. If we'd been able to keep this bill limited to surface transportation and free from the majority's larger partisan agenda, I think we could have gotten the job done. One truly disheartening example of how partisan this bill is that it even has undone bipartisan agreements from the Transportation Committee we'd made on other legislation. We passed a bipartisan Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund bill in October that got swallowed up by H.R. 2. And the $14 billion authorization level we agreed to in committee exploded to an unrealistic $40 billion. Our SRF bill also had a key flexibility provision removed when it got put into H.R. 2. And now my colleague, Mr. Garamendi, the lead Democrat who worked on this bipartisan agreement, has offered his own amendment to reincorporate this lost provision. I'm supportive of that amendment. This was an important and bipartisan piece of legislation, and it never should have been revised to serve purely partisan messaging. This is an example of how today's bill was not only developed in a partisan vacuum, but it has also unraveled proposals that were once bipartisan. That said, H.R. 2 will likely pass the House, but that will be the end of the road, just like the HEROES Act. While America is dealing with a true crisis, we are considering a massive piece of legislation that is nothing more than a messaging exercise that won't do a single thing to improve America's infrastructure because it can't get signed into law. There are several reasons for that. First, the bill is simply too heavy-handed in applying the Green New Deal mandates throughout surface programs, with 2 out of every $5 impacted. Second, as someone who sees the urban and rural divide acutely in my district, this bill does nothing to mitigate those disparities. It shows a clear preference for programs and policies that benefit urban areas over rural areas, and it directs the largest funding increases to those programs that benefit urban centers. This bill restricts building new roads, which further hurts small communities looking to grow. It also limits state and local flexibility to make decisions that best fit their own needs. H.R. 2 also fails to provide any of the common sense streamlining reforms that transportation workers are crying out for. For example, I introduced a bill and have filed it as an amendment that codifies the one federal decision executive order set reasonable goals for project review times and paperwork. This is a widely supported reform that was unanimously approved by the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee as part of their bipartisan surface transportation reauthorization. Again, we could find bipartisan solutions, but the majority would rather pay lip service to the Green New Deal than rebuild our infrastructure for the American people. Finally, as I mentioned, this bill tripled in size the last week and would be a terribly irresponsible use of our taxpayer dollars. I'm not sure how Democrats thought the right direction was to saddle Americans with $1.5 trillion in debt, ignore the highway trust fund's inevitable insolvency, and then ask Republicans to help come up with a way to pay for their bill. As just a $500 billion highway bill, H.R. 2 was already a massive partisan wish list. This new version is a completely unserious proposal. I want to conclude this testimony by noting that there's been so much uncertainty and unpredictability created by the COVID-19 pandemic. What our transportation programs, stakeholders, and workers need right now is some predictability. This partisan bill created by an entirely partisan process denies them of that. And Mr. Chair, if you would allow me to offer some short testimony on the amendments that I've also supported in rules and then also have offered, I would like to do so now at this time. You good? I think you're still on mute.
I'm trying to, okay, good, go.
Thank you, sir. I promise I'll be short. Thanks again to everybody here. I do want to thank Chairman DeFazio for working with me to include in the manager's amendment language related to marijuana and THC level impairment research. Thank you, Chairman DeFazio. While I hope that we can eventually come to an agreement on language to create an objective standard for determining impairment, this language marks a step in the right direction by allowing us to get a better sense of federal legislative and regulatory barriers to marijuana research. My first amendment actually talks about the one federal decision executive order that I just mentioned in my testimony. I already outlined what that was, so I will not go into much more detail. My second amendment doubles the private activity bond cap from $15 billion to $30 billion. While H.R. 2 gives a modest increase to $18.75 billion, it's not nearly enough. And as was stated in Chairman Neal's opening remarks, this is something that has bipartisan support to allow our communities to take advantage of historic low interest rates. It is my understanding that some of my Democratic colleagues asked for a doubling of the cap, so hopefully there's room to improve this amount as the bill goes to the House floor. My third amendment allows the Calhoun Ferry Company in my district to use existing ferry boat programs to and its funding to provide repairs for an approach road leased to the company by the Army Corps of Engineers. The approach road is in dire need of repairs as it often floods, impacting the service provided by the ferry company. This amendment lifts the prohibition on use of funds for such repairs so that my constituents can utilize this vital service. Finally, I want to note my support for two amendments I've co-sponsored, one from Mr. Lowenthal and another from Mr. Norcross. Mr. Lowenthal's amendment requires the Secretary of Transportation to release a standard requiring all new commercial motor vehicles be equipped with the Universal Vehicle Identifier. This amendment is targeted so that the identifier will only transmit information identifying the vehicle and ensures it will not be cost prohibitive for operators. As this will speed up roadside inspections, such an identifier will allow our motor vehicle operators to return to service in a more efficient and timely manner. Mr. Norcross's amendment is a pro-labor amendment that requires contractors receiving certain federal funding to make a good faith effort to meet or exceed the apprenticeship employment goal for the project. This amendment supports our building trades unions and their apprenticeship programs that lead to so many great paying jobs for many of my constituents. With that, I ask you, Mr. Chair, the ranking member, and the committee members to support these three amendments and the two that I've co-sponsored. And I thank you again, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Estes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when our government locked down the economy to fend off the spread of the coronavirus, it was meant to be temporary. But to ensure the economic impact's not permanent, we need to make meaningful headway on economic growth, and that means making an effort in a bipartisan way. We had success in the CARES Act. which passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. We kept Americans employed and small businesses alive with the Paycheck Protection Program, ensuring that job losses would be temporary. Sadly, it seems Democrats can't stick with this bipartisan approach. They wrote a totally partisan bill which would construct just one highway, a highway to the Green New Deal. When the Green New Deal was first proposed, we knew it would be a job killer. But Democrats are proposing a job killer now in the midst of a recession and a global pandemic. It's time to get Americans back to work rather than push Green New Deal tax policies that pick winners and losers by offering federal tax subsidies for energy industries and wealthy individuals. Why, during a global pandemic, would we take this moment to offer billions in dollars of additional electric vehicle tax credits for wealthy individuals buying expensive electric vehicles with no safeguards to prevent abuse? Why do we need to create a new credit for the purchase of used electric vehicles, again, with no safeguards to prevent abuse? At a time when we're realizing the importance of unleashing medical innovation and strengthening our local businesses, Democrats in this bill are proposing extending and expanding special tax credits for energy companies that have come to depend on federal support rather than strengthening their own foothold among consumers. Why is it necessary for the federal government to provide cash refunds for special energy tax credits when taxpayers do not have enough tax liability to use the credits? Why should the federal government provide $5 billion in tax credits to colleges and universities to offer environmental justice programs? Wichita, Kansas is one of America's foremost producers of energy. Hardworking Kansans who power our homes, businesses, and transportation say no thanks to a proposal that appears to come straight out of the playbook of Joe Biden and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Highways have always been about bringing Americans together rather than splitting Americans apart. This bill's got nothing to do with national priorities and everything to do with advancing political campaign priorities in this election year. We can do better. We should do better. We must work together, and we should advance a bill that helps get Americans back to work rather than extracts more money from American workers and businesses and gives it to Washington. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's testimony. Let me just say that, look, I think this is an important bill. I think it's a well-written bill, and I wish it were bipartisan. I wish more of my Republican colleagues would join with us. But I think I'm learning on this issue, and quite frankly, on a lot of other important issues that we don't seem to share the same values. We have some members of this House on the Republican side who don't believe we have a climate crisis. Where is the ability to compromise with people who don't think that this is a reality? And yet, my friends say, well, we should have a bill that incorporates more Republican values. Look, we have to tackle these issues. My friends were in charge for 2 years under this administration and really didn't do anything. We're now coming up with a major infrastructure bill that I think will not only help with a lot of the issues that we all say we care about, but will help transform this economy in the aftermath of this terrible pandemic. And you want to know what's a job killer? This pandemic is a job killer, which makes it even more frustrating that we have a president who doesn't want to listen to the best medical advice and can't even bring himself to say the word mask. I don't know what else to say other than the fact that, I represent a district that is urban, suburban, and rural. And there are things in this bill that will be a benefit to all parts of my district. And as Mr. Neal pointed out, the investments in rail infrastructure, I think, are incredibly important, not just in Massachusetts, by the way, but all over this country. In any event, I want to commend Mr. DeFazio for his leadership on this, and Mr. Neal and others who support it. And again, and by the way, if the Senate doesn't like the bill, they can pass their own, and we can go to a conference committee and work out the differences. The same goes with the HEROES Act as well. Yeah, the notion that Mitch McConnell hasn't done anything after we passed the HEROES Act on, I think, May 15th, when our cities and towns are in desperate need of help so they don't cut essential services. and is appalling to me. But in any event, thank you for your testimony. I now yield to my ranking member, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just point out for the record that Mr. McConnell actually crafted a bill that passed. It was actually called, the CARES Act. That actually began in the Senate, and they succeeded because they actually involved Democrats, both in the Senate and frankly across the rotunda.
Well, would the gentleman yield?
Back to that, I certainly yield to the chairman.
Yeah, I would just simply say that, he did take the initiative on the CARES Act, which, in our opinion, was too stilted toward corporate interest and gigantic companies. It was the House input that actually brought it down so that it actually helped a lot more working people. I'm just simply saying that there's an example where, we both chambers passed a bill and we worked out the differences in conference. And so rather than do nothing, please use your influence to tell Mr. McConnell to do something and we can see you in conference.
Well, actually, he involved Democrats from the beginning of the bill, unlike what's in front of us today. They worked on it together across partisan lines in the Senate, then they worked on it with us. That's not what we're seeing here, Mr. Chairman. Let me go to my questions, though. Mr. Davis, you've been around not a long time as a member, but a fair amount of time, and a long time as a staffer. Most of the time, in your experience, transportation bills, passed with huge bipartisan votes?
Mr. Davis,
Hey, Rodney, you're muted.
Yeah, and it's good stuff. I want you guys to hear this.
You clearly, after this much time with remote hearings, you would think I would learn how to work the mute button. So I apologize to everyone, but all I was doing was complimenting you, Chairman McGovern, the entire time.
About the remote hearings? Yeah.
No. I was complimenting you personally, and everybody here is my witness. To answer Ranking Member Cole's question, I have been a part of every other surface transportation reauthorization I've been a part of here or that I worked as a staffer on have been overwhelmingly bipartisan. That's why I saw a seat on the House Transportation Committee, because I saw it as one of the most bipartisan committees. And I also sought a seat on the House Agriculture Committee that I served with Chairman McGovern on. And that had been, and I hope can get back to being one of the most bipartisan committees. You know me, Mr. Chair. Even the Lugar Center ranks me as the 13th most bipartisan member of Congress out of 435 members in the House. I want to work on things in a bipartisan way. I thank Chairman DeFazio for working with me on a THC level amendment that I know is in the manager's amendment. Those are good, positive steps. But in the entirety of this process, Republicans like me, Republicans like Brian Fitzpatrick, the #1 most bipartisan member of the House, according to the Lugar Center, folks like John Katko, who serve on this committee, we were all, Troy Balderson, all shut out of the process when we have a clear record of being able to work with the other side. This is not what I came to Congress to do. I came to Congress to come up with good agreements. And when the chair mentions we ought to pass a bill, this is a fait accompli. We know, Mr. Ranking Member, that most, if not all, of our Republican amendments are going to get ruled out of order. We know that they're going to pass a partisan bill. I certainly can't wait to get to a conference committee. I like the bill that the Senate passed in a bipartisan way. We ought to be able to do that in the House. But when you have a bill that is being marked up, and then all of a sudden, in the midst of that 24-hour markup over 2 days, it gets changed, the name changes, another $1 trillion gets added to it. My question is, why in the world didn't the Transportation Committee continue to lead on this? Well, we know why. The Speaker and the Speaker's agenda hijacked it, and that's not the way it's been in the past. I certainly hope it's not the way in the future if we can come up with a conference agreement.
Chairman DeFazio, is there any particular reason why you chose not to work in a bipartisan fashion? I mean, it's very different from what we've seen under both Democratic and Republican chairman of this committee for many, many years.
I addressed that in my opening remarks, but I'll address it again. The Republicans offered an alternative called the Starter Act. It did not deal with climate change in any way, not one word, not one sentence, not one section, not one penny. Unlike John Barrasso, comes from an oil and gas state, he put a couple of $1 billion into fossil fuel reduction. Now we're going beyond that in terms of policies and expenditures, because he doesn't believe in climate change either. But in order to get the bill out of committee, he did that. But they offered an alternative that did none of those things. And at the beginning, I said, this is going to be green. And they said, well, don't count us out. Well, then the Barrasso bill passes, and the Republican staff was appalled. They couldn't believe that he included fossil fuel reduction. So from day one, we knew that we could not get to that point. So we wrote a comprehensive bill. We adopted 34 Republican amendments in a 24-hour markup. The 31 of their amendments, which we defeated, were to remove the climate change provisions. So I think the answer is pretty darn clear. And if you don't believe in climate change, then they're in exactly the right place.
Well, that's not the question I asked. I really asked about the entire bill, not just one where you didn't agree. Were there other areas you could have worked with the Republicans on? Because they don't.
I'm not responsible.
We don't get the impression that you chose to work with them on anything.
Well, sir, I didn't write anything beyond my committee's jurisdiction. I did roads, bridges, highways, transit, rail, wastewater, harbors, and that. Any of the other provisions that have been mentioned, tax credits and that would be Chairman Neal. The other issues like broadband is energy and commerce. And as I mentioned earlier, the president did include that in his proposal for infrastructure, which never got proposed. So though you would have to ask other committee chairs or others, I had, those were not written by me, and I'm not, fully knowledgeable of all their provisions.
You think that's a good way to proceed, though? Because you normally have a bill that's pretty bipartisan. Maybe we put too many things in this where there's too many disagreements.
Well, I explained my bill, and I can't really, go beyond my provisions in terms of.
After you, in general, do you approve of this as a process? I mean, because the reality is, as Mr. David suggested in his testimony, this will get through the House, but it's not getting through the Senate. It's not going to be signed with the president. Now, and we'll have a conference hopefully where we can negotiate out some of these differences. But gosh, we usually start your portion of this bill, which usually is a standalone, in a very bipartisan way. That just didn't happen this time. I'm just curious as to why.
Well, there was also mention of the $1.5 trillion cost. I do remember a really, really, bad bill that passed without a single Democratic vote that cost more than $2 trillion, which was a tax gift to the wealthiest among us. The principal beneficiaries, 85% went to people over $400,000 a year. A lot of the jobs we're going to create here are going to go to people who need jobs.
Be happy to debate the tax bill with you on another occasion, although your statistics are just flat wrong. But let me go to Mr. Davis, if I may. Chairman mentioned that there were 34, I think he said, Republican amendments that were adopted. I think that's great. How many were rejected?
There were 112 amendments total that were put forth. And as a matter of fact, let me get back to you on the exact amount. There were actually 240 amendments were considered. And but I do want to address the climate issue because Chairman DeFazio knows that we laid out in our principles that we put into the Starter Act. I mean, Ranking Member Graves, I got to give him a lot of credit. He was able to help us craft what our starting principles were. We laid them out for the majority so they knew where we would begin a negotiating process. I always thought that's how you got a bill put together in a bipartisan way. And part of those principles were resiliency standards. We included an entire resiliency title that was led by our ranking member of the Select Committee on Climate and whatever the rest of the name of that select committee is, Garrett Graves. And there's nobody better to talk about resiliency and climate issues than the person on our committee, Congressman Garrett Graves, who was there to rebuild New Orleans as the lead state official in the state of Louisiana that was going to, that helped rebuild that system after Hurricane Katrina and worked with the permitting process, understands resiliency and the effects of climate more than most. And that's a title that should have led to discussions. Just because it didn't say climate change or Green New Deal didn't mean that many resiliency standards we put forth, Mr. Cole, were not part of an agenda to allow for better building standards in areas that are hit by changes in our climate, especially like Louisiana. And there were 248 amendments considered, 112 were rejected, and many of the Republican amendments we had to negotiate at the end of the evening after 22 hours of 2 days. We negotiated with the chair and his staff to at least allow for some of our common sense amendments to be put into the base of the bill. I clearly hope that that agreement to put those in is not destroyed by the Rules Committee and having those pulled out before that bill gets to the floor, because that was one small yet negotiated at the end of the markup. That was a small victory for bipartisanship in a bill that clearly was anything but bipartisan as a whole.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Davis, if I may. The statistics that I've been given, and I assume are correct, is that about 2 out of every $5 of the T&I bill or section are actually tied to specific parts of the Green New Deal. And if is this simply an effort to use the transportation bill to bring more controversial legislation out of the Green New Deal? And if that is the case, what's that do to the prospects of actually getting a transportation bill passed this Congress?
Well, you and I both know, Mr. Ranking Member, that it just kills the prospects. I actually feel bad for many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and colleagues on our side of the aisle on the T&I committee, because again, in the midst of this markup, again, 24 hours over 2 days, in the midst of this markup, the Democratic leadership decided to take the bill we were marking up and put it into a larger package. And this is where we are today. They changed the name in the middle of a markup. They changed the priorities. If this isn't a process that's wholly led by the Speaker's suite and the people who work in the Speaker's suite, then I would love to be proven wrong on that. But the facts are the facts. And if this is the partisan bill that the Democrats want to put forward, then they're clearly choosing messaging over progress. And we can come together on a bipartisan surface bill. Let's, if you want to pass a partisan surface bill, take the surface transportation portion out, pass it on the floor. Let's get to a conference committee. Let's get something done.
Last question, just on that. Again, going back to history, have you ever seen this many things added to a surface transportation bill in the past? Again, this is something we've done in a very bipartisan fashion. Didn't matter who was running Congress at that particular time. And quite often we had, as we have today, divided government. That, if anything, means you usually got to aim smaller, not bigger, to actually get something done. So is this unprecedented in your view, what we're seeing here?
Well, I've been a member of Congress for one surface reauthorization, the FAST Act. And we had the majority in the House, we had the majority in the Senate, and we were able to still craft what we call the Four Corners Agreement. As a matter of fact, Mr. Ranking Member, when this Congress began, I asked Ranking Member Graves to appoint me as the ranking member of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee. It's the largest subcommittee in Congress. We have 59 members on that subcommittee. And I was excited because I thought we would sit down and use the exact same process that then Chairman Schuster used to be able to have the ranking member of the entire committee, the chair and the ranking member of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, sit in a room, hammer out agreements, where Chairman Schuster's process was there was nothing that was going to be in the underlying bill that all four corners, Republicans and Democrats, didn't agree to. And then frankly, as a committee member who had provisions that they didn't agree to, it was sometimes my own party was against my amendments after a bipartisan agreement was put forth in the underlying bill. And that's a huge difference from where we were. And Chairman DeFazio and the Democrats who serve on the committee, they heard our pleas during the committee process. Things were changed. It was a process that harkened back, and there was a lot of mention about previous transportation infrastructure bills that I was never a part of. But the one that I was a part of was nothing but bipartisan, even in one party control of the House and the Senate.
Well, and again, because I remind you, we did have a Democratic president in 2015, but I've been here for 3 transportation and under various configurations. I've never seen a situation where this wasn't a bipartisan bill. All 3 of those actually made it into law. They were negotiated in good faith. I just don't think that's what's going on here. And I think it worries me because I actually agree that it's a desperately needed bill. I mean, I agree with my friends on the other side. It'll create a lot of jobs, it'll make a lot of progress. It's a good thing to do. But this bill, I think you probably summarized it pretty well at the beginning. We're going to vote for an extension, I suspect, at some point. We're not going to actually craft a bill. This bill clearly isn't designed to pass in divided government. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. And, I'm just listening to this exchange and, I'm sure my constituents and probably a lot of others in this country who might be observing these proceedings are scratching their heads saying, like, what's the controversy here? I mean, a bill that invests in rebuilding our roads and our bridges and our water and sewer systems, which are crumbling all over this country. Money's dedicated to safe drinking water. We have places in this country where the drinking water is unsafe, where people get sick from drinking water out of their tap. Money's invested in expanding broadband. I mean, this pandemic has reminded us about how important it is for people to be able to hook into the internet. If for no other reason, for school in the middle of this pandemic. Money's for healthcare infrastructure. Again, rail. I mean, all of these things are needed, and if the controversy is that we're investing in these ways that also have the added benefit of being good stewards of our environment and trying to deal with the global issue of the climate crisis, that somehow this controversial bill, it's still significantly less than what the president had told Mr. DeFazio that he might be interested in supporting. Boy, it goes back to what I said before. Maybe we just have a different set of values when it comes to some of the major issues before our country. But it's hard for me to believe that, outside of the Beltway, outside of, the polarization of Congress, that these are issues that are terribly controversial. But in any event, I may be wrong.
No, Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
If you would include Republicans in the negotiation, as you did in the first 4 bills that dealt with coronavirus, we actually got real law made. That's not what happened here. And as a result, we're not going to get anything done. And I know you want to get something done. I certainly do. But it's going to have to be bipartisan as long as Congress is divided. And right now, this bill just doesn't measure in that regard. So
going back to the HEROES Act, I remember correctly, the Senate Majority Leader said we don't need to do anything else. And so that clearly was a non-starter, but maybe he's starting to hear from some of his rank and file Republican senators that we need to do something. And similarly, this is about, getting beyond this crisis and getting this economy moving into the future. I'm happy to yield to Mrs. Torres now. See here. Next.
Got to unmute.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments and all of the work that has gone behind the scenes, getting this bill to where it's at. I also appreciate the committee working with my office, although we did not come to an agreement on an issue that is critically important to my district. I do appreciate the fact that they were willing to work with my office in the way they did. In Washington, representing my neighbors and community in California's Inland Empire. Some of you know the Inland Empire is a key logistics hub, not just for our region, but for the entire Western United States. Small businesses across America are the beating heart of our economy, but it is the airport, railways, warehouses, and interstates in my district that allowed that heart to beat. I assure you and appreciate the importance of surface transportation investments as much as anyone else speaking today. And I'm wondering why in the world we are considering a package right now that includes a provision that won't just cost my community jobs. It threatens to undermine the single largest employer in my district. 1,000 people in the Inland Empire earn their living working for California Steel. A full 8,000 people in my community have jobs that fall within California Steel broader economy footprint. All of them are about to feel the crush that this provision, the so-called Buy America provision, will bring. That's because this provision does more than encourage the use of American goods. It picks regional winners and losers in that process. It actually moves the goalpost as to how we define American-made steel. And I have thousands of American jobs in my district that hang in the balance as a result of these arbitrary semantics. To be clear, California Steel qualifies under the Buy American provision in our laws designed to encourage domestic production. But under the provision in this bill, it does not. That's because this isn't about choosing good steel over bad steel. It is about picking some steel companies over others. In fact, we should call this provision what it really is, not Buy America, but Buy East Coast. Because as far as steel is concerned, this provision enshrines into law that only East Coast steel counts and only East Coast steel workers matter, not California workers, not the workers in my district. Choosing favorites among production models may help some American workers, but the problem is it will harm American workers too. It's sad considering California Steel is such a pillar in our community. When they purchased part of the shuttered Kaiser Steel integrated mill in 1984, they hired 1,000 workers who had been laid off when Kaiser closed. I've stood in that factory many times. I assure you, it is on American soil. I did not need a passport to go there because it is in the city of Fontana. It employs American workers, and it makes American steel. Over the years, California Steel has invested more than $1 billion into their facilities, and they've never laid off a single employee along the way, not during the recession of 2009 and not now. We're talking about good paying jobs for a working class community. They are also great community partners, helping to fund and hosting on their property the Intech Center, a manufacturing training hub that has been recognized as a model for public and private partnership. A couple of years ago, I hosted then Secretary of Labor Acosta for a tour of the facility. He was in shock that such a thing existed in the US, where community colleges and small manufacturers could work together to facilitate training for the workers that they need. Many of the workers at that mill are veterans and former prisoners who have a second chance to contribute to society. This mill employs hard to employ workers. Some of these workers, by the way, were trained to also teach at the Intex Center. That's what we're declaring un-American in this provision. A company that has done well by its workers, helped build the community, and allowed thousands of people across the Inland Empire to earn a living and improve their lives. Surface transportation investments are much too important to this nation prosperity to allow these types of provisions to sway private sector markets one way or another. Certainly too important for my community. And like each of you, my community is struggling right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of our businesses are shuttered. Many of our workers are struggling to put food on their tables and keep a roof overhead. We are doing what we can right now to ensure that we have an economy to come back to when we can finally reopen our doors. We urgently need investment right now, but not the type of investment that leaves my constituents out. This provision is a kick in the teeth as we fight to get by. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the pleasure of serving on the Transportation Committee with Chairman DeFazio, and so I got to sit in with he and Mr. Davis during those 24 hours of hearings. But I confess, during all of that time, I had not heard a story like the one that Ms. Torres just told, and I'd like to ask that question of the chairman. We often bring up in the Transportation Committee and here on the Rules Committee our concerns about corporations that are not good to their employees, about folks who do put profits over people, about folks who do cut and run at the first sign of trouble. But the company that Ms. Torres just described in California Steel, that is employing the hard to employ, that is going to bat for folks even in economic downtimes, it's coming in and picking up the ruins of bankruptcy and putting a community back on its feet. Tell me about that decision. How was the decision made to prioritize Buy America in such a way that it leaves out Ms. Torres' constituency?
Well, actually, she offered that amendment for the school construction portion, and it was not germane to our committee. We did not mark up anything to do with school construction on our committee, so it was not offered in our committee.
So for all of the highway projects, all of the other work that the 1.5 trillion does fund, her constituents and that constituent company will be available to participate in all of those contracts?
I believe that this company imports its slab from China, and that is the issue. If they didn't use Chinese slab, they wouldn't have any issues. They'd be fully qualified under any of the provisions of the bills, as far as I know.
Well, I know that's the benefit of being able to have the hearings and get into the nitty gritty, because I know that constituency is going to want answers. And yes, if you show up to work for every day in a gritty, hot and dirty job, you feel like you're doing American work for American taxpayers, and I'm sure there's a budget impact on that as well. Let me go back to HR 22, the FAST Act, for a moment. Mr. Davis was a little modest when asked about it. He actually introduced that bill back in 2015, as I recall, introduced it with bipartisan co-sponsors right off the bat, as I recall. What I don't remember, I was a junior committee member at the time, and you may, Mr. Davis, is did we move the FAST Act through committee in one of those four corners agreements?
Absolutely, and that was the process I was talking about with Chairman Schuster. It was Republicans in control of the House and the Senate, President Obama in office, and the Republicans and Democrats on the House T&I committee were tasked with putting it together. The chair, the ranking member of the full committee, and then the chair and the ranking member of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee, which is the main reason why I asked Ranking Member Graves to appoint me as the ranking member of that subcommittee to be able to use that process again. But we didn't have that chance.
Well, my colleagues may not even know about a big four agreement because most of you all work on partisan committees. Not so with Mr. Davis and Mr. DeFazio and myself. These big four agreements, and again, I wish we talked about this more because folks back home don't even believe Congress operates this way. What that looked like under Republican control is that the chairman and the who was a Republican and the ranking member who was a Democrat of the full committee, and then the chairman of the subcommittee and the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee, if those four people didn't all approve of an amendment, then the entire amendment was rejected. So as a rank and file member, I'm trying to move a good idea through. I don't just have to write the Republican red meat bill that appeals to my chairman of the committee and chairman of the subcommittee. I've got to write the common sense amendment that's also going to appeal to the two ranking Democrats there. And it was an extraordinary process. And Mr. DeFazio, I talk about your committee all the time back home because just as Mr. Davis was excited about serving there for those reasons, I too was attracted to it for those reasons. When was the decision made not to move the surface bill through in a big four kind of agreement?
As I've repeated to the ranking member and to you, when it became clear that we could not address climate change meaningfully and work it out with the Republicans, because someone said 2 out of 5 of the are from the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal has no legislative language. It sets hortatory goals. This bill is, the Green New Deal is a non-binding resolution of some sort. This is applying principles to deal with climate change. If you believe with climate change, we got to deal with fossil fuel pollution. The largest source of fossil fuel pollution in the United States of America is transportation, by far. So if you don't deal with it, you're not dealing with climate change. Now, if you don't believe in climate change, we don't have much to talk about on that issue.
Now, to be fair, I remember one of our committee meetings early on where you said, listen, we're going to work together on this just the way we always have. Now, there's going to be a climate title, and maybe we're not going to be able to get together on the climate title, but we're going to do everything else in partnership. As I viewed the process, I'm not one of the big four. I'm way down the dais. But as I viewed the process, I didn't see that partnership on all of the other titles. So I understand, in fact, you said so in your opening statement, that you've heard this is not a bipartisan, this bill's not bipartisan because it does include climate change. I would have said this bill is not bipartisan because no one ever reached out to a Republican along the entire process of crafting it. And I ask you because, golly, serving as the chairman of the Transportation Committee, when a surface title has to be authorized, that's big time game day. And nobody wants to see a surface bill not get done. And I recognize that our process on our committee has been hijacked by larger forces, hence why we have Chairman Neal here, who I look forward to talking with in just a moment. But the roll call headline was, with no GOP input, stakeholders feel House Highway Bill may stall. Not partisan Republicans feel it, but folks who actually want to get something done. I think back to that HR 22. We increased transit funding in year one of HR 22 twice as much as a percentage as we increased highway funding. Over the life of the FAST Act, transit funding went up more as a percentage of transit funding than surface did. And no doubt that's largely attributable to you and your commitment and your a passion for those pots. But we know what those dollars turned out to be because it actually became the law of the land. Had it just gone into the dustbin of legislative ideas, we would not have that data today.
Well, to the gentleman's point, as I said, there were 31 Republican amendments offered in committee to strip the climate provisions. There was, the bill is woven together in such a way that you can't separate climate. If you wanted to do it the way Barrasso did and throw in a couple of titles that could be enhanced or just thrown away to get Carper on the bill, by the way, nothing has happened since it came out of committee. Nothing has happened on transit in the Senate. Nothing has happened on rail in the Senate. We're moving all those things in this bill. And, it would be impossible to get 31 amendments and your alternative would have no climate. Well, we just are not going to write a surface reauthorization in the 21st century that doesn't deal with the largest source of fossil fuel pollution, which we believe is contributing significantly to climate change, which we believe is real in addition to COVID.
I understand that that's going to be the place that we return. Again, it was the place that your testimony began. This isn't bipartisan because it includes climate change. As you know, the Republican alternative include the first resiliency title in my history of surface transportation bills. It's absolutely false. It is
Resilience is not climate change. Resilience is looking at the reality of severe weather events, but not going to the source of the severe weather events, which is climate change.
It is
and sea level rise. That's what resilience deals with. That is not dealing with climate change. That says, well, the seas are rising for some reason. We better deal with it. That we're having floods like we've never had before. It's flooding highways, taking out bridges. We better deal with it. But we don't know what's causing it, and we're not going to deal with it. That's bottom line. We just totally disagree. Do you agree that fossil fuel pollution is something we should deal with meaningfully in this bill? Yes or no?
I don't just agree that fossil fuel pollution is something we should deal meaningfully in this bill. I believe that we have moved bill after bill after bill to make those incremental changes. And
I'd love to have you point them out because there's nothing in your alternative. It does zero on climate, zero, not an ounce of reduction of carbon.
I had the pleasure of being a part of a resiliency hearing here in the Rules Committee. And I can tell you that your very narrow definition of resiliency is not at all a reflection of the breadth of conversation that we had in the Rules Committee along those.
Right. So you do believe fossil fuel is a problem and climate change is real and you want to deal with it.
I promise you I'm driving more electric cars than you're driving, Mr. Chairman. My personal commitment and my policy making go hand in hand. And what is totally false is any suggestion that you make, and you make it over and over again, that you cannot find Republican partners on climate change. That is totally false.
I might be able to find a few, but not on the committee.
Reclaiming my time, what is totally true is that you have not reached out to Republicans on the committee to partner on climate change. My ranking member said to you specifically, nothing is off the table. I want to be involved in everything. And you made the decision, or someone made it on your behalf, that partnership was not to be in this title. I sound energized and frustrated. I'm certainly not frustrated with my chairman. I have zero concerns about the love my chairman has for this country and for his commitment to transportation and infrastructure. I don't believe there's a single member on the committee who was more prepared to lead than Chairman DeFazio was when his name was called. I do believe that the chairman has been a part of a very successful bipartisan partnership on this committee for decades, and that we threaten in this bill to turn that partnership on its head. If I could go to Mr. Neal just for a moment, Mr. Chairman, I was so pleased that you were going to be on this hearing because, as Chairman DeFazio said, we don't have the most important things in our jurisdiction. Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Eleanor Holmes Norton at the time wrote a letter to the last chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Ryan, two chairmen ago, and said, we absolutely have to get together and have a by-committee hearing on funding and revenue streams. I'm tickled pink that my chairman is focused on plussing up transportation accounts, but I know in my chairman's heart is plussing up transportation accounts in the way that they are paid for and thus sustainable over time. And we just don't have that jurisdiction. And if we did, I have no doubt Chairman DeFazio would have put a revenue title in here. All of the things you mentioned in your opening statement, I didn't hear a highway trust fund revenue conversation. Are we moving a highway bill in partnership with the Ways and Means Committee, but do not have a revenue section, whether it be gas taxes or diesel taxes or vehicle miles traveled taxes, all of those things that we've all talked about for so long and we know are desperately needed?
We began this conversation, as Mr. DeFazio said, at a meeting at the White House. And the conversation at that point was based upon the broad conceptual outline of what was needed, and we all agreed to that. We decided that even though we could not reach an accord on that occasion over how to finance it, that the best way to do it would be to put out a piece of legislation and begin the negotiations with the administration and eventually and hopefully the Senate. Now, Mr. Woodall, I think you would agree that interest rates are at record lows, and for the foreseeable future, they're going to be at record lows. So there's a broad opportunity here to do a lot of borrowing based upon the needs of the country. We took full advantage of the tax code for the opportunity to address the issues as they relate to climate change. And I know that you were pretty worked up about the climate change initiatives that we put in here, but they're all reasonable because we actually put out details about how to best do it. So on the renewable front, it's wind, it's solar, there's biothermal. We put out a lot of ingredients in this, but I've always felt on long experience here, Mr. Woodall, that the best way to negotiate is to have a piece of legislation to negotiate from. And I think when we pass this legislation, I think that the administration is likely to begin negotiations and discussions with us. After all, the president campaigned hard on this legislation. And what better way to take some of the pressure off the highway systems and to include more money for rail? These are the sorts of things with electric vehicles, and I'm glad to hear that you drive one. That's terrific. But I also think that this is a rare opportunity, largely based upon the fact this is something the country desperately needs right now, to invest in our whole system. And when somebody raised an objection about broadband, broadband has to be extended. It's an issue of competition. It's an issue of 911. These are things that have to be done. So I hope that, as described here, that we can begin an earnest negotiation once this legislation passes on Wednesday or Thursday with the administration. And I fully expect, based upon conversations with the administration, that we're going to find an agreement in the near future.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you that if you can't have something pre-conferenced ahead of time, which leaves rank and file members out, so I certainly don't support that process on a regular basis. Having a piece of past legislation to negotiate from is exactly the right way to jumpstart a process that has been stalled. But my question was, I don't see the Highway Trust Fund revenue section here. You are absolutely right. The best way to start a negotiation is to put our position out there. I don't see a House passed position on revenue.
One of the things that we were concerned with, because repeatedly, when you do negotiations in this modern era of Congress, one side always pounces on the other once revenue measures are off. So we thought that this ought to be done in unison once we reach an agreement as to how best to pay for it. But I think we all agree upon the idea that part of it will be borrowing, part of it will be Build America bonds, part of it will be raising the cap on private activity bonds. And we will fully get around in a bipartisan manner to the revenue side as well. And I think that's the best way for us to proceed, Mr. Woodall.
Well, now, I'm not naive. What I think I understood you to say is we've decided to do all the spending in a completely partisan manner with no Republican input whatsoever. But in our considered wisdom, we have decided that the revenue section should be saved until we can move step by step together there. I understand that as a philosophy of governance. I might question the wisdom of doing that in this particular in this particular case. That was the roll call headline as well. Two plans for investment, talking about the Republican plan and the chairman's plan. Zero ways to pay for them. I regret because I know, as the Chairman Neal says, revenues need to be a partnership decision, and in fact, we talk about getting this process started in a partisan way. We all know this process only finishes in a partnership way. And again, there's nobody who wants to see a surface title pass more than Chairman DeFazio does. Not pass this House, but pass into the law of the land and make a difference for families going forward. I do not believe that the Transportation Committee is going to be forever silenced in its bipartisan ways by this partisan exercise. But I see the frustration in friends like Ranking Member Davis. I saw the frustration in my Ranking Member, Mr. Graves. In fact, both Mr. Graves. We do have the largest committee on Capitol Hill under Chairman DeFazio's jurisdiction, because folks love to do the work that Chairman DeFazio has been entrusted to do. It makes a difference for every single family across this country. And I regret that, to Chairman Neal's point, the bill that comes out of the House later this week isn't going to be that partnership document that will be moving quickly to the president's desk. It will be that partisan negotiating document that, with any hope, with any luck, will in fact serve as the foundation of a productive discussion. Mr. Chairman, with that, I thank
you
Chairman for being with us, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern, and I want to thank the three chairmen, Mr. McGovern, Mr. DeFazio, Mr. Neal. I thank you guys for having a lot more patience than I have. Because when I listen to the ranking member and to Mr. Woodall, I have to say, what bill are they talking about? Because this is an infrastructure bill. This is a bill that isn't limited just to surface transportation. And when Mr. Davis was providing us his testimony, listening to Mr. Woodall, it would simply to be roads. This is far beyond roads. We have an infrastructure problem in this country that involves schools and housing and broadband and the electrical grid, and it goes on and on and on and on. And the president recognized this a year or two ago. And so to try to describe this and limit it to simply a surface transportation does not do the subject justice.
Could I ask my friend from Colorado yield just one moment?
I would. I almost was going to do a point of order during your presentation, Mr. Woodall, but I certainly would yield to you because you're my friend, even though you're testing my patience.
I certainly don't ever want to test the gentleman's patience, and certainly don't want to betray his friendship. I'm talking about surface transportation because the only witness I have here today came from the committee that moved a surface transportation bill. If you brought me an energy and commerce witness, if you brought me an education and labor witness.
So
thank you for
I'll reclaim my time. By my count, we have another 26 witnesses to listen to this afternoon. And you're going to get an opportunity to talk to all of them, including Maxine Waters on the housing section of this. And I assume Bobby Scott will be here to talk about the schools construction. And we're going to have, given the economy that we're facing now, we're going to need to be building a lot of things and put a lot of people to work. So this goes far beyond just surface transportation. But I want to thank Chairman DeFazio for working with me on a couple of amendments. One involving the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Equity Act, which once a transportation program has repaid its loans, they ought to get repaid, get paid back. In our case, the RTD in Colorado, the Regional Transportation District, is entitled to some $30 million in being repaid for a prepayment of its loan. And also, I want to thank the chairman for working with me on some United States Geological Survey research issues into minerals that the Transportation Committee worked with me on. I do have a question for Mr. Davis and for Mr. DeFazio on the THC amendment. Can somebody explain that to me, since I happen to be working on the Safe Banking Act, working with the Senate on a research component to try to determine THC levels and a lot of different things. So explain to me how you're amending the Controlled Substance Act, or what it is you're doing in this THC amendment.
We are not amending the Controlled Substance Act. The original proposal of Mr. Davis would have gone more in that direction. We negotiated it to simply allowing what are called university transportation centers, who have various expertise all around the country, to research ways and concerns relating to potential impairment by people who have taken a little too much dope. And I come from a legalized state. Rodney comes from a legalized state. Here's a big problem right now. We had the most dependable test out there is a hair test. So a lot of trucking companies are now saying, if you want a trucking job, we're going to cut your hair. And if it tests positive, we won't hire you. Well, that person could be living in Oregon, and they could be, smoking or eating on a weekend and be perfectly, straight on Monday through Friday. But they're going to get potentially, discriminated against. So if we could find some kind of real-time testing that could be used, or near real-time testing that could be used by trucking companies and by law enforcement, I think it would be tremendously beneficial. So we're authorizing for research to try and find ways to deal with this.
Okay.
Yeah, if I could add, Mr. Perlmutter, to what Chairman DeFazio said. Yes, we worked an agreement out on this amendment that would allow for the traffic safety research needed to be able to hopefully get to the standard that we all agree we ought to be able to have at some point, a roadside test that would determine what is a level of THC that could cause impairment like other substances. So it's just initially, as Chairman DeFazio said, allowing that research to happen in a traffic safety sense. I think it was too important to both the chairman and to me and others who, like he said, have states where the voters either enacted recreational marijuana use, or in my state where the legislature enacted it. We ought to be able to ensure that the roads are safe too, and that no one's impaired. But we got to do the research, and it was too important to let a transportation discussion go through without approving at least some policy discussion to allow that research to continue in the sense of transportation.
Well, obviously, coming from Colorado, I support you two in this amendment. I think it is important. I think that we blocked research in too, broad a fashion when it comes to anything that has THC in it. And so to the degree that this really starts to loosen some of that research so we can understand the effects of marijuana and THC in a much better way, I'm all for it. So I just appreciate this amendment. This is a bipartisan amendment. Amendments. And so I just want to end with, that Mr. Cole has made, that you made, Mr. Davis, that, this is just rammed through by the Democrats. And this is like, at least there are parts, and this one, the THC amendment being one of them, that certainly are bipartisan or generated. When you guys make your argument that, Republicans were shut out of the process, that's not true. And with that, I will yield back.
Bridges.
Very well. Did I successfully unmute? All right, great. Thank you. I thank our witnesses for being here today. Yeah, I'm way over here on the end. Next, I'm having to turn around, Rodney. Yes, during the 114th Congress, I was the chairman of the subcommittee on Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade Committee. I did the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's investigation into the faulty Takata airbags and the resulting injuries and deaths that occurred from the faulty airbags. So my understanding is the last recall has happened. That we coordinated remedy program, but we've kind of reached the end of that. Is there anything going to follow on in its place? I think we still have the problem with the airbag. I don't think we found them all in the.
I think there was a change in policy in this bill, but if there was, this is something that clearly has to be corrected as we move the bill forward.
If I could address that, if the gentleman will allow me, it's not within the jurisdiction of our committee.
Sure.
That would be the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Yeah,
The,
that's we did the principal work
Yeah.
and actually
right. Yeah.
the owner of Takata Airbags to admit that they had some culpability and it wasn't all up to the automobile side. Well, there was national the faulty airbags, and at the time it seemed done significantly understaffed. So I offered an amendment back in 2015 to the Transportation Appropriations Bill to increase the Office of VSEC $4 million in that the defects investigation more fully staffed.
Sir, I would hope it is. That falls under jurisdiction of both Energy and Commerce and Appropriations. Again, we don't, we have safety in highways, transit, and that. At the committee, airbags and design of automobiles, that's Energy and Commerce, I believe. And then the funding would be appropriate. I hope it's fully funded, and if not, I'd support it in the appropriations process this year.
Energy and Commerce rules hearing. Of the Rules Committee, if I may.
Hey, can you repeat your question?
Like, from the Committee on
No.
Energy and Commerce. Mr. Davis, yeah, just say I trying to do on the DHC question, but I know we have to do something because what we're doing right now is not working. Had two rather horrific occurrences in the casework that I've done in the past. One where a young man was struck road at nighttime, probably not at the crosswalk, maybe not have been the best decision he's ever made, but he lost his life. The person who was driving the car also probably had their life forever altered in a very bad way. That individual had blood alcohol content of less than 0.08, but also a positive test for THC. Injury decided, since it's under 0.08, there's no reason to bring a charge. And that young man who died, his mother came in to see me and was just distraught that there was not anything that could be done to allow for the mitigating factor of both alcohol and marijuana, or alcohol and THC simultaneously. That ability is, or DA, local DA to bring a case. And it was just severely tragic. And I had another 18-wheeler accident. It was only marijuana that was involved in that accident, but it's just we are unprepared to deal with what we are facing right now on the country's roadways, with perhaps the combination of marijuana, probably the most common, but there's others, and know that we need to get there.
You know, I certainly agree with you, Dr. Burgess, and, you know, whether we agree recreational marijuana legality, opportunity to come together and at least put policies in place when we're debating bills like this, be it through T&I with this title of the bill, or through energy and commerce as we move forward, or through transportation or energy, to make that happen. Mr. Perlmutter, and I would like to really address something Mr. Perlmutter said. I am glad that we got some negotiated Republican amendments into this bill, but to accept Republican amendments desired by the majority. It was forced. If not more of those amendments, as we were going to probably be there for another 36 hours to vote on every single, or probably 80 of the over 100 amendments that Republican members offered to go along with the many. I'm glad we got some type of agreement in the end, but I will say it was kind of forced.
Along a similar line, we did have a hearing, which I think was the first one that's ever been held, and it was an offshoot of the flavored tobacco debates that we had last fall after the multiple lung injuries with the vaping. Well, I think we didn't get to the root of the problem, which was the contaminant in the THC and the contaminated on the black market. So again, about this, and it's not too soon to start and I'll look on the and I do support I think we're all very fortunate that we had the broadband, we had the bandwidth that we did as we had. Certainly telemedicine, homeschooling, or you look at what's happened in some other countries, and they've been severely taxed. The networks have held up. Underscored the fact that more investment here is needed. Now, this bill creates the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth within the National in the Department of Commerce. So the duties include connecting with communities, holding regional workshops, and promoting access to broadband, developing training, and we also have the Federal Communications Commission actively facilitating the deployment of broadband in rural and underserved areas. And they're also working with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to update broadband mapping. So will growth, what does it bring to the table with what is happening now currently within the existing structure of the FCC? Can anyone tell me that?
That would be in the energy and commerce section. Apparently, according to the chairman, not going. Other witnesses will be.
Well, to this, I mean, there must have been some idea of what this new office, what the contribution of this new office would be.
No, not in my committee. We didn't consider anything regarding broadband. Our only issue right now is the FCC giving away a spectrum, which is going to destroy the GPS system. Other than that, it's going to make a lot of money for this company called Legato. Everybody is saying.
The question, I mean, this bill that we're considering right now, the one that we're having the hearing on in the Rules Committee, does create the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth. Is that correct?
I am not familiar with the energy and commerce provisions of the bill. I don't know why energy and commerce isn't testifying, to the best of my knowledge.
Mr. McGovern, I think it's an oversight that we're not including members of what us representatives.
I think this is painful enough.
Well, decision that's being made and debated, Ralph, or so. The Air Act, and everyone was at each other's.
I could only hear every other word he
A major
said.
piece of legislation like that, and I think we all agree. Legislation, it's been enduring long, that we have to get it right. Of this bill that we're considering today, but Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
So, our normal procedure is that we hear from the committee, the minority asked, so we also hear from Ways and Means, and we have commented on that. So that's why the panel is what it is. From Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I don't have too much to add other than I really want, and Mr. Neal and Mr. Fazio for doing a great job. I mean, we have known for years that America's infrastructure is crumbling. The highways and the ports and the airports and cybersecurity, the whole thing. And we need to invest in America. And the Invest in America Act I hope that Americans who are tuning in have the sense that the House of Representatives, anyway, is acting infrastructure crisis in America in a way that also priorities, they go together. So it's very I hope that the rest of the country sees these just incessant process complaints for I was in the minority for my first 2 years in Congress in the last term, and in the committees I sat on, I was never consulted on anything. The Democrats weren't consulted on anything. So to hear how much the Democratic leaders have been consulting the Republican amendments, and some people just don't want to take yes for an answer. When they're in power, they act like King Kong. And then when we're in power and elections have consequences on our side, suddenly they want to turn the whole thing into a Quaker Friends meeting house where we got to operate by 100% consensus. to my mind, a recipe for absolute paralysis and inaction, which is the opposite of what the American people want. People want action, investment, engagement here. And I've got to say to my beloved friends across the aisle whom I love serving with, let's do something. What we get is, well, we can't go with this and this and this and this because the Senate won't go for that. So we have to allow the Senate to dictate to Mitch McConnell, and he said Trump is not going to sign anything on our own because we have subservient to the president. Well, why don't we just get rid of the whole system of government that we've got then and let on a whim basis? Don't get me going on what we learned over the weekend about Vladimir Putin, American soldiers, and the administration not doing anything about that. Institutional self-respect, we think, is the best plan, and not constantly defer to people's house of government. And I'm very proud to be supporting what you guys have done here. And I know it's going to be a long day. So
Thank you, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members. I do have a couple questions. The first one's for Mr. Estes. Congressman Estes, I think in your testimony, dollars in additional electric vehicle tax credits for the wealthy buying expensive cars with no safeguards. Can you explain this? Are people getting to purchase electric vehicles? Because I think you're right. Electric vehicles I've seen are pretty darn expensive.
Thank you. One of the concerns that we see from a tax credit standpoint is that overwhelmingly the number of people taking advantage of the tax credit are the wealthier individuals. And from a standpoint about looking at working folks across America that residents that because they don't have that income, they're ended up paying more taxes to provide the tax credits for the wealthier individuals. And what this bill does is it doubles down on that the original electric vehicle tax credits was set up intentionally to expire as companies were able to produce vehicles and to reach a sustaining level. Car companies that are actually manufacturing and have hit the limit, and what this bill does is says, well, now let's go back and make sure that we continue to provide credits and support that when we know the industry works, we know people have vehicles that work. That actually fuel economy as well for us. And the issue here is we don't need to double down and increase on our spending on those tax credits.
I think you need to unmute, Mrs. Lesko.
Thank you. I think it's a legitimate issue to bring up, Congressman Estes, because I know when I buy a new car, much less an electric vehicle, I had to buy some old used vehicle that I had to get repaired often. So it does seem that people that are just struggling to get by, subsidizing people that can afford to buy more expensive electric vehicles. It's just something to the effect of providing special tax credits to energy companies that don't even have the tax liability. Is this the energy companies that maybe didn't even make any check? Is that correct?
That's right. What the with the tax credits now that have been offered, that are available for companies to take advantage of, but again, they don't have the actual tax liability to use that. And so the position within this bill, because they're enough to take to offset in lieu of that, which is kind of defeats the purpose of why would we do. We'll give you one program, on top of that a second program, instead of saying work to move forward, take advantage of the one you have, get the and move
And
forward.
Congressman Estes, wouldn't this, like, let's say there's an energy company that doesn't have a good product, making money because they're not selling it, they would still get this.
It would be able to utilize the process and have cash payments.
Thank you.
for
And my
that.
next question is for, that is, how much money passenger rail? Like in Phoenix, we have what's called light rail, but it's really like light and costs billions of dollars a mile towards that, and bridge repairs, that type of thing. What percentage wise is going to passenger rail, light rail, that type of thing?
The passenger rail section dollars, and that they would be only under the transit section of the bill.
And when you vehicles, is public light rail?
There's transit is where you would find what we call light streetcars or anything else like that. This is 60 billion for rail,
Thank you, and I yield back.
passenger railroads.
Thank you, Ms. Cameron.
Panelists joining us today. I'm so excited to be here during, and this is certainly a bill deserving of its own week. HR 2 will make meaningful, long overdue investments in our roads, bridges, airports, ports, and transportation systems. It will invest billions in zero emission buses on our roads, reduce gridlock, and we have some of the worst gridlock in the country in my district. So I legislation. So when I hear my colleagues talk about the price tag on this bill, I have to wonder where exactly they think invest directly in American families, in workers, and in the communities we all live in. Have been crying bill for years before I was ever sworn into office, and this bill doesn't come a minute too soon. Families facing double-digit unemployment in the U.S., a massive investment, exactly what we need, which is the gateway to the home to the Philadelphia port and shipyard. It's home to one of the busiest airports, home to the Eastern Seaboard's passenger and streetcars, subways, and roads, all of which are in serious need. This bill isn't fix potholes or the steel used to investment in the American people at a time when we need it more than ever. The erosion of our environment and give children and families the support they desperately need to live and succeed and thrive. But this bill also lays down the critically important principle that when we invest, we have to do so and beyond, rather than trying to recreate an unsustainable or inequitable economy of the past. So I'm proud to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chairman DeFazio and others who testified. I could not have spoken. I think a 1.5 trillion is not only critically needed from the infrastructure point of view, but it couldn't come at a better time in terms of our need to stimulate an economy that's going through pressures and serious stress. Bridge, transit, rail, airports, ports and harbors that traditionally come under transportation facilities, housing. This is, and I'm reminded of another New Deal. The New Deal by Frank Depression decided that putting Americans to work, whether it was the WPA or the Conservation Corps, SOUP programs, which helped faith in their government and the need that and their belief that the government would step up to do what was necessary to help lift the nation. Here today, others have said this better than I, but this is not that we and then dig it again, fill it in. This is infrastructure that's been necessary for allowed to get to a point of such disrepair. I remember being so impressed, I guess probably a year ago, and Chairman DeFazio may have even been at the meeting, Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO, who perhaps came together to talk about an investment in our transportation system. I just got off a Zoom call this morning with the American Council of Engineers, who were talking about the desperate need to rebuild America's infrastructure. And what I like about this is it doesn't see infrastructure narrowly, but it sees infrastructure as it ought to be. So I'm excited to be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your. I'm excited not only to vote for the rule, but to vote for the bill tomorrow on the floor. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Common issue, change in traffic. In this bill, I'm proud to say that we're really tackling both issues because we can't address our infrastructure without addressing the defining challenge of our time. During my campaign, that every time traffic lights change is not a debate. My district, as we know it, will simply not exist in a matter of mere decades. Is flooding our streets and to takes bold transportation sector and to cut carbon emissions and prioritize resilience. Chairman DeFazio's of us from South Florida, the T&I committee specifically on these issues for the infrastructure bill. That the bill included ensuring that infrastructure reuse projects like the Underline in my district are eligible under the DOT's Build Grant program. Anyone who spent any time in Miami knows that traffic isn't science. It affects our quality of life. According to a recent study, a driver in Miami spends a year stuck in traffic. And according to another study, whether you're walking, taking public transit, of which we have very little, or driving, Miami's working families endure one of the worst. Instead of spending time with family, instead of being at school, instead of contributing to our economy, my constituents, this bill will make a difference. It funds infrastructure to reduce gridlock and addresses bottlenecks, including to synchronizing and safer for all of us, including this bill keeps our cargo moving at our nation's ports, like the Port of Miami, which I also represent. Affordable housing, it includes, it increases broadband access, it protects